Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Julie Kang, and I am on the board at Seattle City Club, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to our Civic Cocktail on Bridging Washington's Divide. How many of you are here for the first time? Welcome! Delighted to see you all. I want to express my deep gratitude to our speakers who took the time out of their busy schedules to join us today, and all of you in the audience for attending this important event. I also want to thank the staff at the Collective, Bermudas Media, and our sponsor, Comcast. And finally, please help me welcome our moderator, Scott Greenstone, politics reporter at KUOW, and co-host of Sound Politics. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, great. Is it okay if I just sit? I felt weird not getting up and taking it, but I'm Scott Greenstone. I report on politics for KUOW. Thank you all for being here tonight, and I'm going to thank our illustrious, august crew here in just a minute and introduce them. But before I do, and actually I think once I do, maybe I'll ask each of you to just say a thing or two about what you do and why you're here. But really quick, I just want to say why I'm here. Last year, when I was covering politics, my favorite part of my job is I have to talk to politicians a lot in my job. I don't really love that part. I do love talking to voters, and we talked to so many of them last year. We had these voter panels of 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and 6 independents, separate voter panels, and what I was blown away by was just how many, I think Sandeep called them like heterodox voters I talked to. I talked to a gay Democrat in Suquamish who was voting for Harris but also thinking about voting for Dave Reichert, the Republican. I talked to a bunch of Republicans who were planning on not voting for Trump, which I know does not really represent the country. But I think I bring this up because when I talk to voters, what I tend to experience is we are not so stuck in our bubbles and divided as we tend to think, especially as we tend to think when we talk to politicians, when I engage online, and even when I look at mainstream media, which of course I work in. So I'm hoping tonight that we can have a discussion about how we kind of, bring our institutions, our, media ecosystems, our academic institutions more in line with where I think voters, tend to be. I think that a lot of the division can be a mirage, and I hope I'm not sounding naive when I say that. So, who better to speak about this whole thing than the folks here? Let's start with Brandi Kruse, host of the unDIvided podcast. Tell us very quickly what you do and why you're here.
Yeah, hi, Brandi Kruse. I host a political show and podcast called unDIvided. I spent about 15 years in mainstream news in Seattle, 3 years with the CBS radio affiliate, 10 years with the Fox affiliate, Fox 13, where I was the political correspondent. And I quit that job in the fall of 2021 to do an independent show, switch from journalism to political commentary. So unDIvided is basically a show. I tell people it's not kumbaya, we're all gonna be undivided. To be frank, I think that there's 20% of people on either side who really have no interest in engaging in meaningful dialogue with anyone. So my main goal is to shut them out almost entirely and focus on the 60% of people who are willing to talk to each other and have rational conversations about how we fix these problems that seem to be plaguing our state and our country.
Okay, thank you. Jodi Sandfort is a dean and professor at the Evans School of Public Policy and co-lead on the Project for Civic Health. Jodi, why are you here?
Thanks for having me. I'm Jodi Sandfort, and I am here because I'm a newcomer to Washington. I've been here for 4 years, deeply committed to this state, really feel like higher education needs to be part of the solution. And the Evans School is really focused on supporting the democratization of public policy and really trying to fundamentally inspire public service. And it's such an important thing right now given what's been going on in the world. Young people don't say, oh yeah, I want to sign up for public service. And so we need to help them build the skills so that they can be in dialogue, debate, and really help us all roll up our sleeves and get some work done.
Great. Sandeep, Sandeep is a political hack, a consultant, and co-host on...
Don't say that with such a disparaging tone.
And also co-host of Seattle Nice. So we've got some good Seattle podcast representation here. Sandeep, why are you here? What do you do?
Well, so I do political and public affairs work and have in Seattle since I moved here. Well, I started out in journalism when I moved here. I wrote for The Stranger for 3 years when I first came to town, and then moved on to doing political campaign work, and now I do campaigns and public affairs consulting. And so why I'm here, or why I think this conversation's interesting and important, is because I think that the overarching story of American politics of the last 30 to 40 years is the story of ever-increasing polarization, right? I mean, that is the dynamic that has sort of driven almost everything else that's happened. We're growing farther and farther apart. Even though I think, Scott, your initial point is right, I do think there's a very inchoate, mushy middle in the country that is sort of, looking for some kind of meaningful consensus to emerge, or sort of receptive to the idea of that. But everything that drives the sort of political class and our politics in America pushes in the other direction and pushes us into sort of tribal camps. And so how do we sort of square that circle or fix that divide, I think, is one of the central, or if we will, right? I shouldn't say how we will, I should say if we will, or if we really even want to, is, I think, kind of sort of the central question of American politics today, right?
Great. All right. We're going to go through some moderated questions, and then we are going to take audience questions. So be thinking about the most intentional, well-worded, and short version of your question while we go through these. So before we talk about bridging the divide, let's talk about how it plays out in Washington State. Someone recently said to me in an interview that Washington State's divide is less. The political spectrum here is less like Republican to Democrat as the rest of the country understands it, and more libertarian to socialist. And that is an interesting perspective. But I think that if you look at Washington voters, they are very particular. They're very different. They, don't like income taxes, but they seem to love taxing the rich, based on the most popular of the 4 initiatives from last year. They like the Climate Commitment Act, but they don't want to, to have the option taken away to burn natural gas in homes and restaurants. I want to ask each of you, what are the characteristics of the red-blue divide in Washington State, and how does it compare with the rest of the country? And I think let's start on the opposite side with you, Sandeep.
Yeah, what are the characteristics of our politics? I think American politics used to be a lot more kind of regionally or locally distinctive, right? I mean, there are still distinctive things, right? As you say, we have a particular history around the income tax in Washington State that's sort of different from other places. I think that's still very alive and real. But a lot of our politics, including in Washington, have kind of homogenized nationally over the last 20 plus years. It used to be like there was a thing we called the Northwest Republican. You think back to sort of the Dan Evans, or back when I first moved to Seattle from the East Coast, you had people like Sam Reed who were in office, who were like the old school Republican. Kim Wyman was probably the last one of the Republicans who, they were Republican, but they weren't. They were a different sort of, they tended to be kind of environmentally conscious, sort of green, moderate, socially moderate to almost liberal in their worldview, and then fiscally conservative, right? There was a very distinctive Northwest kind of style of Republican. That's kind of mostly gone, right? The Republican Party, 1988 is the famous time when the Republican Party caucuses in 1988, Pat Robertson won the Republican Party caucus, and that was and then 1996, Ellen Craswell wins was such a conservative. She left the Republican Party soon afterwards, declaring it too liberal, right? But she won. She was the gubernatorial nominee for the Washington State Republican Party in 1996. So that was the sort of beginning of a change towards our politics, even locally and at the state level, becoming more nationalized. So the Democratic Party has become more conventionally progressive, right, in its structure and rankings. I'm sort of, as I've gotten older, becoming more and more of an outlier in my own party because I'm not on board with some of the latter day, viewpoints that the party has sort of taken up. I think to its detriment nationally, though, this stuff plays well locally. So I think we still have some distinctive features of our politics, but I think those are like the kind of grace notes on what is largely a story of us becoming more and more like, the kind of politics you have in Washington, D.C., right?
Jodi, you've been here for 4 years. What are all the ways that Washington State is weird and different than, and where did you move from?
Well, I moved from Minnesota,
Oh, where at? That's where I'm from.
St. Paul.
Oh, okay. I'm a little farther north,
Where are you from?
by Fargo, North Dakota, kind of by the boondocks.
Where?
You know where Moorhead is?
Sure.
Right there.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Look at bonding.
divides already.
Bridging divide.
Bridging.
Well, I know she's nice
Yeah.
because she's not fake nice like here. Minnesotans are really nice.
Yeah.
Well, so I will say, one of the things I agree with 100% is that the polarization that's happening here is similar to what's happening across the country. And political scientists call it effective polarization. And it's a little different than what people have thought about before because there is a deep otherizing that is happening in the rhetoric. And that this is part of what people feel. We've done some polling about how hard it is to have conversations with your family members because you're in a context where your media, your friends are all telling you that the people who believe differently than you are really not just different than you on these issues, but fundamentally at their core different than you. And that means that it's very easy to say, I don't want to talk to you, we aren't going to talk politics, and just not actually get into the kind of discussions and debates that have been essential to this country since the beginning. We need to sit with people that we care about and talk about differences and try to figure out how are we all making sense of it? Because I think one of the things that's really driving this is we've all just lived through the largest revolution since the creation of the printing press. The way we get our information is fundamentally different than it was 20 years ago. And we are all trying to make sense of how algorithms are shaping then what we get, how we understand the issues of the day, and what are trustworthy ways of making sense. And when you have those media sources telling you what to think, then you get scared to test that reality with other people who are in your social networks. And then we have this mountain ridge running down the center, which means that certain kinds of people believe they cluster over here, and other certain kinds of people believe they cluster over there. I actually have found Washington State to be really divided around ideology, but kind of uniformed in the fact that we don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out how you implement the ideas of our politics. There's a lot of rhetoric here. I think I agree that there is a pretty big middle. And I've really been struck with, the public sector feels really old-fashioned to me. There's not as much connection to some of the nonprofits, private sector innovation, and a lot of disconnect because of the demographics of the politics about how do you have to compromise to actually get stuff done. And that's been shocking to me. I didn't expect that when I moved here at all. And it's funny because there are a lot of Midwesterners here, and so there is this kind of this espoused pragmatism, but I don't see it in practice sometimes, and that's been surprising.
That is so interesting. I have so many questions. I wrote a story recently about the fact that Democrats are pouring into this state, according to at least one analysis from a political consulting firm, and Republicans are leaving. Which is, contributing in a big way to, our shift. We're the only state in the nation that didn't really see we saw a very tiny shift toward Donald Trump last year, less than any other state. And a lot of those Democrats are coming from Wisconsin and Michigan, which I thought was really interesting. But that is a side note. Brandi, Jodi was talking about new media. Your new media. Tell me about but you've covered Washington for so long.
Yeah, I mean, been here for 15 years and covering politics for most of that. I actually disagree a lot with Sandeep's characterization. Sandeep and I love each other. We're each other's favorite foil.
Yeah.
We're
on too many panels
I
today.
actually think that Washington State has become pretty extreme. I don't know how we can deny that when we look at the way the Democratic Party in the state, which accounts for almost all of the political power, I don't know how we could deny that when we look at the extent to which we've allowed the homelessness crisis to flourish, the extent to which a party that I think had good intentions initially is perfectly content letting people die in filth and squalor with needles in their arms. In Olympia right now, they're working to reduce punishments for online sex predators of children, for people who cook meth around kids, for people who use guns to commit a crime, for gang members who recruit juvenile gang members to commit crimes on their behalf. Those aren't moderate policies. And those are things that have support in Olympia. So I have a hard time. I mean, our state nationally is very extreme to the left. It truly is. And I think one of the challenging things, and certainly I've experienced it, and I've shifted to the right, I think as a result. And that's what you see with this. When I moved here when I was 25, I mean, I voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I voted for Donald Trump in 2024. If you want to throw anything at me, throw it now. But I have my reasons, and I think when you see people absent reality and common sense continue to vote for the same things that have taken our state down such a dark path, when you look at the things that really matter, and the same party in power for 40 years, it has a way of almost making you go to the extremes. It's like, well, I'm not that, and if I'm not that, what am I? And so I think we have this interesting, we have the far left, which kind of takes over the political conversation. We have this large swath of moderate Democrats that cowers to the far left and won't say what they mean because God forbid. And then you have anyone right of that who's very alienated. And so we had a moderate, very moderate Republican Party for a long time, and we still do. They're not in Olympia pushing restrictions on reproductive rights or anything like that. They are a moderate Republican Party, but that hasn't gotten them elected being moderate. And so now I think they look at everything happening and they're like, well, I don't care anymore. Like, yeah, I support Donald Trump. Yes, I support ICE immigration raids. So it's almost like you see an extreme and you become an extreme. Like my mom, she thinks she's a Democrat. And I laugh because she talks to me about the issues and I'm like, you are not a Democrat. And I tell her, if I plucked you out of Minnesota and I dropped you in Seattle for 3 years, you'd probably vote for Donald Trump. Like, it's just this interesting. So I think the far left extreme that we've allowed to bogart our conversations in Seattle in particular has created a weird political environment here that alienates basically anyone right of Sandeep.
Do you want to respond to that at all? You don't have to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually, Brandi and I have criticisms of where latter-day cultural progressivism has gone. I wrote a piece in 2021 at Post Alley when early in the year, in 2022, before Dobbs, when it looked like the midterms were shaping up to be a bloodbath for Democrats nationally, right? And I wrote a piece saying, you know what, Seattle, it's your fault, right? That we're about, and I think the fact that the Republicans kind of shoved the Democrats out of the way and reminded voters, we're even more batshit than they are. Look at what we just did on abortion, sort of changed the dynamic of what happened in that midterm. But it's masking, this is where Brandi and I kind of agree, it's masking some trends that are happening in the kind of bubble of, particularly in blue cities like Seattle, that are creating what I would call a class and a culture problem for the Democratic Party. It's not really a problem here in Washington State. We still win. But it is a problem for us nationally. It pushes people into the arms of Trump. It's not just, the Brandi Kruse of the world that are moving that way, but we're seeing significant erosion of black and brown non-college educated voters in the United States of America that have been moving in what I would call the wrong direction, and that is not a function of the price of eggs and what happened with inflation. That's been happening. We can trace it back to 2016, right? It's largely a reaction to essentially white educated progressives imposing a set of countercultural progressive values onto more culturally traditional people, and they're rebelling against it, right? And so the Democratic Party has a problem. That said, where Brandi and I diverge really strongly is there is no way in hell that I can make common cause with the Republican Party as it is today. The party of MAGA and the party of Trump is out in, I just find some of the stuff, I see lots and lots of examples of open, unrepentant racism, you know,
You
on
think
social
that's
media.
Widespread? Like
I
amongst
do.
people who
Well,
support
and I
the
don't
president?
want to say like that I think Republicans are open, but I see in the era of Trump, you know, I get that people don't like the DEI regimes and some of the, you know, and some of the re-racialization of the public sphere, and some of the stuff that I have a problem with too on my side. But what I don't get is reacting to that by saying we're going to get rid of Black History Month and we're going to like not see diversity as important
You're
anymore.
currently celebrating Black History
Yeah,
Month.
yeah.
Donald Trump did not get rid of Black History Month.
Man, I mean, some of the stuff you know, the blow up over H-1B visas that we had, like right after Trump got reelected, you see like these very, very prominent right-wing social media accounts just blatantly racist about Indians and what, you know, and I'm just like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not on board with you and with that, like, and I will never be on board with that,
Well,
right?
Can I comment on that? Because then actually, as a academic, I think you might be able to mediate something here. Because I'm not a Republican. I voted for Trump begrudgingly. It wasn't like I hopped, skipped, and jumped to my ballot and threw it in the mail. I mean, it was something I came to late. Certainly, I didn't vote for him in 2020 either. But I think the way you characterize that is part of the problem when we talk about divisive politics. It's like, you know, I'm seeing this racism. You know, 77 million people voted for Donald Trump. And whenever I hear it characterized that way, it's like, okay, would you look at me and say I'm racist? We've known each other for a long time. Do you think I'm racist?
No.
I had this conversation with Congressman Adam Smith, who says, you know, the people who support Donald Trump, like they're putting someone in office who's a threat to democracy. And I asked him on my show, and he's a Democrat. I said, do you think I'm a threat to democracy? It's like, so I think there's this element. They said, yeah, I am a threat. I am a threat to democracy. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have
I did.
We'll have questions.
I did, and I disagree with
keep it
some
respectful.
of what he's done already so far. You know, I think his executive order on birthright citizenship is unconstitutional. I am not a slave to a party. I'm a slave to the Constitution. I don't support the idea of occupying Gaza. I don't support him kicking the Associated Press out of the Oval Office. I talk about these things on my show all the time. But it's about nuance and saying we're not going to, you know, let's look at why people voted the way they do, because I could flip it on the far left and the racism they espouse toward white people in this city. And I know you don't, this is a crowd that probably doesn't want to hear that, but that's true. And when we talk about DEI and those elements, let's have an intellectual conversation about how DEI is fundamentally in contrast with what this country is supposed to be about. And there's, you know, there are black conservatives who agree with that as well. And so I think this rush to like, well, you're a racist, you're a Nazi, you're a threat to democracy. The bottom line is Donald Trump won. Do you want to understand why? Or do you want to sit there and shout, he's a threat to democracy and you did that? It's up to you.
Yeah, Jodi, I wanted to talking about, you know, kind of understanding, right? Well, actually, let's start with what your thought you were going to share. Yeah, I don't want to cut you off.
Well, I think this conversation about DEI and transgender, and I think it's all a distraction. I think that the real issue is that right now what's happening in DC is a fundamental shift in the centralization of power and authority in the executive branch. It goes back to Hamilton. It's an idea of the way the federal government operates in relation to states and local governments, in relation to the judicial and the Congress. And I think that the institutions are really, really vulnerable, not because of Donald Trump. Again, that the data has been really clear. For 40 years, we have been increasingly not investing in public institutions, from everything from public education to the way elected officials are treated. 87% of local elected officials say that in their time in office, they have felt threats of violence, right? And discomfort. So why would you? Any normal person, my husband was elected official, it's a really, really hard job. And people don't understand the basics of democracy at the local level. And so good people, there's a high cost for being involved. And so I think, to me, what the real issue now is, do people understand that things are happening right now in Washington, D.C. to centralize authority with not regard to the rule of law? It's unclear if the courts will be able to respond. It's unclear if Congress will be able to respond. It's unclear what will happen if the federal government pulls its grants. And so I actually think what's happening now is going to call the question on some of this stuff about, do we actually have a middle that people say, whoa, this is not the country, that this isn't the way I thought it worked? Or are so few people remembering what we thought the intergovernmental system and the separations of power was supposed to work, or not? Like, I literally don't know.
I think this dovetails really well into, not that I don't want to talk about the other Washington, but this, we are trying to talk about bridging divides in Washington State. And the Project for Civic Health that you worked on has promoted 3 major fixes to political polarization in Washington State in an op-ed in the Seattle Times last year. Can you talk about those 3 fixes and what they entail?
Yeah, so this is an effort that was really been shepherded by Lieutenant Governor Denny Hecht, who was interested in all the polarization he was seeing around the state, and so began to have just listening sessions with really diverse people. And in 2023, we brought about 130 of them together down in Renton and said, what are you working on that you think other people should know? And it was amazing. The superintendent of public instruction was saying civics in schools. Association of Washington Cities was saying they were trying to really build more safety among these elected officials. Lieutenant Governor wanted to create what he has created, a bipartisan commission, to really think about how is the way we do the legislature trying to bridge the divides, because you are right, it has become extreme, and the little things that used to help institutions like the legislature stay together, like being able to have dinner with each other, you can't do because of some of the rules, worries about corruption. But what it means is that people have fewer opportunities to get to know each other's people and to really be able to debate a policy issue, but still be able to hang out afterwards. And that's been the long tradition of governing. So Lieutenant Governor is working at the legislature. We've stepped in with the Ruckelshaus House Center at WSU to do some work with local government officials around collaborative leadership. 50 people came together from the reddest red parts of Washington and the bluest blue parts of Washington, and rather than assuming that they were coming in at opposition, we said, what do you have in common? And you know what they have in common? They all said yes to public service. And so you put that at the center, and then you give them, well, how do you make sense of these local issues around housing, around transportation, around environmental protection? And if you get people focusing on the issues, there's more in common than we think at the local level. And so that's been a really important part of the Project for Civic Health. And then we're also just trying to connect people on the right, people on the left who are worried about this, so that we see ourselves as part of an ecosystem that say we actually want to maintain a level of civility in this state, because actually that's what's really important for democratic sustainability, that people have civic experiences and they get off their phones.
Cute.
Yeah, touch some grass.
And you're all here, so you're
as
having
the-
a civic experience, so good for you.
As the Gen Z say. So some recommendations that have come from like Democrats like Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez or Derek Kilmer have said that other states should look to us to depolarize their, politics are open, blanket, nonpartisan primaries where independents can vote for Republicans, for Democrats, things like that. I want to know, should the country learn from us, or is our system flawed? And I'm curious what Brandi thinks about that.
I got to be honest, I don't have a strong opinion on it because I don't think if the intent is to depolarize, I'm not sure that it has depolarized anything. I mean, we still have, I fundamentally believe the party system is ruining America. I do believe that we need somehow some sort of successful independent movement. It's really hard, right? It's hard because you don't get the access to the voter information, the donor information, the doors, and all of that. It makes it almost impossible to run an independent campaign. But we also don't have like an open primary in the sense that whoever wants to run in the party is running. I mean, they are beholden to the Democrat on top who gets to dictate. Look at Bob Ferguson. Bob Ferguson was always going to be the nominee. There was really never any room for a Democrat to have a serious challenge against him, and the party was never going to allow it.
And you see what happens when they do, like with the Commissioner of Public Lands, they almost lose sometimes.
Right, and so, people talk a lot about like term limits, for instance. And if voters want to put Jay Inslee in office for 3 terms as governor, they should be able to do that. The problem with that is that nobody will step up and challenge him until he leaves, because that's about party structure, party loyalty. So it robs voters of the ability to choose from the very long list of people who were more qualified than Jay Inslee to be the governor. So I don't know that changing the open primary, whatever it is, system will fix this issue. I think that getting away from the 2-party duopoly will fix the system.
Yeah.
I will say, I think the particular idea that they put forward is just one of a laundry list of things.
Yeah.
And the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has a whole big laundry list you can look. 100 years ago, we had similar issues happening in this country, and people said, okay, how are we going to try to change some of the rules that are driving the way elections happen, the way parties happen? We can do that again. We just have to say we care enough to try and make sure that we aren't having a system that decreases the ability of people from diverse points of view to run for political office. We have to get back to that. Otherwise, it's just like Tammany Hall. It's just like a machine. And we can't have that either because it makes people cynical. And if people are cynical, they don't engage. And that's where we really have a problem.
I would love to strip political party from the ballot so nobody has a D or R next to their name and you actually have to look at what the candidate's about. Because I think Washington's in this place because we have too much straight ticket voting, and there's a lot of different shades of Democrat, a lot of different shades of Republican.
Yeah,
Well, I was going to ask about, I'm glad you mentioned Tammany Hall, because I was talking on the Sound Politics last year about how I think we vote. I think we vote too much. I think we vote for too many positions. It's a progressive era idea that we've had for the last 100 years. And the idea was the average voter is going to be very engaged and they're going to want to elect a commissioner of public lands. And I don't, so I was like, should we do that? And then my co-host was like, so you want to go back to Tammany Hall? I was like, I mean, maybe there's something in the middle. But Sandeep, I wanted to ask you about, one of these other recommendations that people, I think that one that the Project for Civic Health made was ranked choice voting, and potentially that could be kind of a fix.
Was that an eye roll?
And I know Sandeep has thoughts about ranked choice voting.
That isn't actually a recommendation. It's just one of the laundry lists that we should explore.
Yeah.
Oh,
There's
okay.
no magic bullet.
Sorry. It was in the op-ed, and I didn't realize it wasn't a recommendation.
There's no magic bullet.
Yeah. Yes.
I
okay.
agree with that. There's no magic bullet. Look, I think we can tinker with the structure of how we conduct our elections. I think there are some approaches that I actually generally like the top 2 system we have here, right, where it's a blanket primary. Everybody, regardless of party, is on the same ballot in the primary, and the top 2, regardless of party, move on. It's not perfect. It can have problems, like in the Lands Commissioner race, where you have a mismatch of 5 Democrats running and only 2 Republicans. So even though there were way more Democratic voters in that primary, it came within, 49 votes of 2 Republicans coming through. I was actually the consultant for Dave Upthegrove, the Democrat who eventually won that, so it was like touch and go for us in that race. But so that was not. I think that is a structural flaw of the top 2, but generally it works pretty well. Closed primaries, I think, are terrible in that regard, where you have to pick a ballot for your party. It really, so ranked choice voting, you asked me about that. Like, so progressive activists in Seattle, and I passed a ranked choice voting initiative a couple years ago. We're about to implement it. Want to push it in other places. It's been pushed in other cities. In the context of a top 2 primary, fine. I don't care, right? As long, if we want a ranked choice in the primary between all of the candidates, and that. But I will tell you, when you do ranked choice in a closed primary, it drives the vote to the extreme. So let me give you an example. New York City had a mayor's race 4 years ago. With first time they had ranked choice voting. But it's a closed primary, so you either vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. So about 25% of New York City votes the Republican ballot, totally separate ballot. The other 75% vote in the Democratic primary. Eric Adams, who was sort of the moderate candidate running at the time, candidate of kind of black and brown people in the outer boroughs of New York, he won the primary in the straight up vote by like 8 points. He barely got through the ranked choice process because as it went on and all the other progressive candidates were sorted and stacked out, the vote kept pushing towards the candidate of the Upper East Side of Manhattan, right? Who was this sort of conventional left progressive candidate, right? And I think, pardon my French, the shit would have hit the fan if Eric Adams had been wiped out 2 weeks. It took him 2 weeks to do these arcane calculations to like then throw over the black candidate of non-white New York and the outer boroughs, and for the candidate of like rich woke progressives, and so that's a function of these things all fit together. That's a function of having a closed primary structure where that's what progressives want, right? They actually want that. They're doing it. Their motives are not so pure.
I was just going to say, thankfully Eric Adams won, and now everything is fine.
Because I do think the motives are less than pure. They want to put their thumb on the scales
Right.
of the process to push it in a direction. I don't think it works in the top 2 primaries. I don't
Right.
care, but yeah.
You look to the people who are supporting ranked choice voting, and it's the people who believe there are electoral benefits to ranked choice voting, and that's the left. There's a reason why, especially in a state like ours, where they already have a monopoly on power. The only changes they'd make to our electoral process are things that strengthen that in some way. So for that reason, I'm very skeptical of anything they want to do to continue to consolidate power.
That's interesting, though, because Alaska kept ranked choice voting narrow margin, barely, but and that has resulted in some not so extreme results.
Well,
Jodi,
Mary Pelota won, but then she lost, right, under the same system.
Sure, but I just mean that it seems like there's been results that are not extreme left or extreme right from that.
Let me just sum it up this way really quickly, and then I'll shut up. The problem in our politics with the answer to the problem of polarization in our politics is not a structural change. It is a cultural problem. And if you don't fix the cultural problem, you can do whatever the hell you want with the structure. You're still going to have the problem, right, of polarization.
Well, I was going to say the same thing, because what I worry about with any of these, like this, ranked choice voting is now the flavor of the month. It's a technical thing. It's a technical fix. And right after the election, we had an event at Town Hall where we brought Sam Reed, Kim Wyman, and the current Secretary of State to talk about how do you actually do election administration. And Steve Hobbs, the current Secretary of State, is very much opposed to ranked choice voting, in part because it's really technical. It's really hard for everyday people to understand it. And at this moment, when there have been so many claims about corruption in the voting system and systems not working and all of that, that would only fuel that perception if people can't figure out how their vote matters. And I think that, to me, is a reason very much to step back from some of these more technical matters. We have to regain the cultural belief that there is some integrity in the process. The last election did what it did. Some people are very happy. Some people are very distressed. Society is now changing because of that vote. So if nothing else, we see that political power is significant. It's going to change things substantially this time in the country, which will then change Washington State.
Yeah.
One can only hope. One can only hope.
I want to talk about media right now. You know, we're sort of we've kind of talked a little bit about you go online and things are, you know, inflamed, maybe is one word for it. I'm thinking a lot right now about these situations where sound bites go viral. Obviously, we're in the middle of one where the state Senate Majority Leader, you know, said this thing about parental rights in Washington. It went viral. It was picked up by some big, you know, right-wing, you know, X accounts, picked up by Fox News, and you know, I think that the focus when I'm trying to like pay attention to just like I'm trying to figure out how we talk about it on the podcast and give people like a conversation where they walk away from it knowing something that they didn't know before and feeling like they can be like they learned something, which is my goal always. I'm struck by just the fact of like the discussion becomes who's operating in bad faith. It becomes, well, was he really taken out of context? Did Fox News take him out of context? Was he just describing a law? And you know, when I talk to people around the newsroom, I actually realize there's a lot more nuance to these conversations. So for instance, he said, if your child is over 13, you don't have a right to know what's in their, you know, you don't have a right to consent over their medical records. And the defense from Democrats is, well, that's state law. And you know, talking to folks like around the newsroom, like I grew up in California, that's also state law there. Florida, it's the same way. Arkansas, it's actually 12. It's an even younger age. But then I was talking to my executive producer, who's from East Coast, and she was like, that's, like, you tell anybody on the East Coast that I, a parent, can't access my kids' mental health records, and that sounds crazy to me. It's a divide that is really interesting because it's not really red-blue. It's like more like where you're from and what the norms are. And I'm just wondering, like, Brandi, how do we turn the temperature down on these conversations and have conversations that are more like what we're having, like, with people we see, rather than people we interact with online, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I started the first 30 minutes of my show today was on Senator Jamie Peterson.
I listened to it.
So yeah, and on this exact conversation, and there's so much more nuance to it. So I've been very critical of what I call the legacy media. I mean, you know that. I came from that environment and I left that environment for those reasons. Overarching, the media drives a lot of our division. The media drives the narrative, so the media drives the division. And this is true right and left. You watch Fox News, it's the same thing as MSNBC, just in reverse. So if that's where all you're getting, that's how you're gonna think, right? And that's a problem. And you know, politicians are gonna do what politicians do. And the media is supposed to hold them accountable for it, is supposed to cover those issues with the nuance that they need in order for you to understand it. For instance, your characterization of our law and Jamie Peterson's characterization of the law. The issue is he does a soundbite, he says, well, that's state law, don't blame me. And what he doesn't say is that that law has changed significantly since 1985. In 1985, they passed a law that says if you're over the age of 13, then you can access mundane things by yourself. You can sit down with a counselor by yourself. You can get treatment for substance abuse issues by yourself. That's not controversial. The issue is that Democrats, including Jamie Peterson, have expanded dramatically in the last 5 years what mental health services entail. Now you can get gender-affirming care without your parents knowing about it because they've categorized that into mental health care. They're limiting other ways in which a parent can engage with their child, medical records, mental health records, reproductive care. So it's those sort of nuances that are lost. I think legacy media like sound bites, and that was a sound bite we saw, and both sides missed the nuance of it. Listening to that sound bite didn't give you the full picture you needed to understand the story. And you know, Jamie Peterson, the senator, took to the media and said, oh, I was taken out of context, which just isn't true. And then the media didn't do its job to explain to people what the context of the situation was. So I think the media has a big role to play in this. It's one of the reasons I'm so critical of them, probably more so than politicians. But I think one of the ways to bring down the temperature is we have to stop giving the fringe groups an oversized influence in public dialogue. I mean, at the city of Seattle, for years on end, we've allowed the far-left socialist alternative to take over almost every city council meeting and yell and scream to the point where it's shut down, and we do virtually nothing about it. And now it happens at almost every public meeting where they don't get their way. So we've fostered that environment, and it's not healthy. I mean, we don't really have a right-wing, very organized to speak of, that disrupts things, because there's not too much of it here. But we have to treat them in the ridiculous way that they're behaving, and just sort of shut them out so the adults can have a conversation on the issues. And unfortunately, if we continue to give that far, far fringe too much attention and time, we're always going to have this issue. And in other states, that would also apply to the far right fringe.
Jodi, I'm curious, what your thoughts are on how can we put context back in the modern debate? I feel like it's all platitudes for me tonight, but.
Well, I will defer to Sandeep, because I feel like this media conversation that you all can have feels very not connected to what I think a lot of people are paying attention to anymore. I think many people agree with your analysis, and young people aren't participating in the traditional media ecosystem anymore, and people are searching to where are there trustworthy grown-ups that I can help make sense of all of this that's going on.
And what I think I'd just say, and I know Sandeep it's such a good point, because I don't believe that independent media is the answer per se. It's the Wild West. You go on social media, there's some independent people who call themselves journalists, and they are not journalists by any stretch. Now, people will say I'm a journalist, and I correct them and say I'm not a journalist, I'm a member of the media, I'm a political commentator, I give my opinion. I don't want the reporters on King 5 News or the Seattle Times doing what I do, because that's not journalism. So I think that there has to be some place between here. The legacy media has a lot of introspection to do. And I'm happy to talk about that if you want talking to about the legacy media. But at the same time, this isn't a healthy environment either. The proliferation of independent outlets that have no standard except the standard they give themselves. And so at some point there has to be a whittling down of who's trustworthy and who's not. But who decides that?
Well, and because we don't have that now, what's driving it is the algorithms. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And so to me, that's also what's really important in Seattle to have a conversation with, because so many people who live here are writing the algorithms.
Yeah.
That's a great
Should we go
point.
find them?
Yeah,
They're
let's go.
probably like here somewhere.
Maybe we could pull a socialist alternative on them and drag them into the streets. Sandeep, you're kind of in the media a little bit. You're quoted probably daily by some outlet somewhere.
Well, not daily, but I would say, so I guess the first thing I would say is you look at the surveys, and trust in traditional or legacy media is at an all-time low, right? The example I think of in the last week of the presidential election, right? What happened? Donald Trump goes and does this rally at Madison Square Garden, right? And some comedian makes a joke about Puerto Rico, an island of trash, or whatever the joke was. And for like most of that entire week, the narrative in the traditional media was like, my God, what a terrible, disastrous screw up by Donald Trump and his campaign. Latino voters are incredibly angry. Puerto Ricans are moving en masse to vote for Kamala Harris. They drove this entire media. I kind of bought it, right? I was watching. I was like, yeah, man, they probably pissed a bunch of people. It was a completely erroneous narrative. In the last week of a campaign, when you looked at what actually happened in the election, Puerto Ricans were moving in the other direction to Donald Trump. They didn't give a crap about the stupid comedian and the joke or whatever. So the loss of credibility of legacy media is, I think, a terrible thing. I also think I kind of agree with Brandi a lot. Some of it is due to just the fragmentation, cultural fragmentation, technological changes, rise of social media. The radical democratization of information flow created by social media has been a net negative, I think. Because it allows all sorts of weird clustering around. We have, not to sound too highfalutin here, but we have it's created an epistemic crisis where we can't even agree on what the truth is anymore. There's a whole bunch of things that have happened, right? That said, the legacy media, KUOW, you guys brought a lot of this on yourselves, man. I mean, I agree with Brandi about that. Like, you guys did a whole bunch of stuff like where you decided that you were going to indulge your own sort of personal, cultural, progressive worldview in your coverage, and you got it wrong, right? You didn't even understand where most Democrats were for a while, right? And you adopted a whole kind of worldview that alienated a lot of people. And there was a period where I was listening to KUOW. I can't listen to this shit anymore. You guys are crazy. I don't need some 25-year-old white producer at KUOW jamming Ibrahim Kendi down my throat. I have an experience of race in America, that you, Scott Greenstone, do not. I don't need you to tell me how I think about race, right? That's not why I listen to the media. And that's what happened for a little while. It pissed me off, right? And I stopped listening. And so I don't mean to pick on KUOW. I'm ranting a little bit about it, but that happened, I think, to a lot of traditional media in the country to their detriment.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, I always tell people you can identify, and I'm glad we're talking about this because I do think the media is the key. We have to have media. I ranted about Donald Trump on the show today. Yes, I'm capable of doing that because he shut the Associated Press out of an Oval Office event for refusing to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. So it's just petty stuff, and even though I think the Associated Press does a bad job a lot, I'd still rather have them there than not have them there, and so I will always defend legacy media and the First Amendment, even though they would never turn around and defend us when we're shut out from events because we're not the real news. But there's a couple elements here that I think are important, and I'll be local about this. In Washington State, when it comes to the legacy media, Republicans and Republican ideas are guilty until proven innocent. Automatically, there is a tough microscope on them, and they have to prove, however they're going to be able to do that their idea is valid. On the other side, you can be as fringe left Looney Tunes as you want, pushing things like police defunding or whatever it is, and your ideas are assumed innocent until proven guilty 100 times in a court of law. And that's a really frustrating thing for people who operate in that middle 60%, who want to talk to the media about things like, hey, the same party's been in power for 40 years and our homeless crisis has doubled. Hey, the homicide rate has doubled over the last 12 years, but God forbid it's a Republican coming to the media with that sort of perspective. It's really like there's an assumption of bad intent, malintent, whatever it is. And until we change that, and for the record, I actually prefer the treatment that you're giving Republicans. I believe it's the media's job to be overly critical. I would much rather the mainstream news treat everyone like they treat the Republican Party in our state right now. Because if all you're doing is being too harsh on Democrats and Republicans, amen. That's what we're supposed to do. But instead, one side gets these kid gloves. Bob Ferguson got kid gloves his entire campaign. Dave Reichert was painted as some right-wing extremist, which is so hilarious if you know Dave. And so I think that's a frustration I know a lot of people who align with me more so have. And then it pushes them to these independent outlets who are spewing inaccurate information, sometimes hateful information or whatever it is. So it's like this nasty cycle.
I just want to name, I think we're having a very much a Western Washington conversation right now.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think literally, if I was watching this in Yakima, I would not understand what we're talking about on the stage.
Well, I think what I'm trying to advocate for are the people in Yakima.
Absolutely. But this is what I mean. The fact that you have to even say what you're saying and that it's perceived by some people to be provocative. Like, I think what you're saying is right on. And I think...
See, I'm not such a bad person.
No, and I really do think...
Wait, that's not allowed. We're not allowed to agree. We're not allowed to agree with Brandi.
I like this. We're going after KUOW, and Brandi Kruse is right on. It's the best day of my life.
Jodi nodding.
And I'm just going to really quick. I didn't mean to pick on KUOW or
it's okay.
Scott, or I can say that I have the same criticism about the Seattle Times or whatever in that period.
I do. We had some. Oh, Jodi, I don't want to cut you off. We want to get some questions from the audience. And Julie, I'm wondering how we want to do that. There was a version of the. Yeah, I'll hand you the mic.
I think we'll take a little quick 10-minute intermission.
We've got questions, so yeah, keep them to 20 seconds.
2 questions, both very short. One, closest statewide race in 2024 was a state Supreme Court race where there was no party affiliation on the ballot. Could you speak to that? Second question, reputable polling regularly shows most voters in Washington state think the state's on the wrong track, but they continually vote for initiatives and politicians who've gotten the state on the track it's currently on. Please explain.
Okay, that sounds like at least the first one was to
The
Brandi.
Supreme Court one is obvious. I mean, absent a political affiliation, some of the other races that didn't have a political affiliation were also closer. I do think there's a lot of groupthink. I've got to vote for the Democrat because Orange Man bad and anyone with an R next to their name is affiliated with them, which, whether that's fair or not, Donald Trump has a 33% approval rating in our state. Anyone with an R next to their name was dead on arrival, even someone like Dave Reichert. So I think having that non-affiliation was really helpful for Dave Larson. I wish he would have won, but not so much.
Anyone else want to
Sure,
touch
I'll
those?
just quickly, a couple of thoughts. I mean, so I'm going to go back a little bit to ancient history of local politics. Back in 2007 or 2008, a group of King County Republican donors got together and they ran an initiative to make King County races nonpartisan, the King County exec race nonpartisan, because they had a plan. They were going to run Susan Hutchison, who was a Republican, pretty right-wing Republican for Kent County executive. And they passed an initiative. Voters were like, of course we should make it nonpartisan. We don't like the parties, we should make it nonpartisan. And then the next year they ran Susan, and she was like, refused to admit she was a Republican. She kind of said, I'm a moderate nonpartisan. She kept saying that. And I was doing Dow Constantine's race. He was running at the time. We weren't the front runner on the Democratic side. And we called a press conference. And I was just like, man, Dow, we just got to, F this shit. Like, we just got to go and call her out. And because the Seattle Times wouldn't write that she's a Republican. And we had a press conference. We pulled up all of her donations. We called her out. We set her position. She gave $500 to Mike Huckabee. She called, and she's a stealth Republican. And it changed the race. Like, that's how we won that race. So I don't think hiding the ball is the answer, right? About, like, people have a right to know, like, where you are, and like your party affiliation gives you some sense of, like, what your worldview is, or so I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I do think though that what was your second question was about oh yeah. But I do think that the flip side of it is that we've gotten so polarized and so tribal that it's very, very hard. The gap between the parties is so wide, it's very, very hard to get somebody to cross over. And you said Dave Reichert, Brandi and I have talked about this. I thought Dave Reichert ran a utterly crappy campaign for governor.
I've said that.
And he had an opportunity. There was polling at the beginning of that campaign that showed that there was a space where maybe even a moderate Republican could win in Washington State. It was an open seat. It was kind of harking back to where Rob McKenna almost beat Jay Inslee in that first race. Dave Reichert offered nothing to moderate Democrats that would get them to cross that chasm and vote for him. He was so worried about his right flank. He sounded like all these kind of weird Law and Order, kind of right-wing sort of thing. I was like, this is not a moderate campaign. I couldn't imagine voting for Tiffany Smiley, right? Remember when she was like going to run this? She was nothing. She did a debate with Patty Murray. She couldn't even say that climate change had a human cost to it. So I was like, if you as a party if you as a candidate can't meet the other side, the voters of the other side halfway, you'll never get them to cross over, right? No matter how much disquiet they have about their own party, I'm not crossing over to vote for a Republican unless they're coming over to tell me that they are willing to agree with me. And
I would say that Reichert, just spent lots of money on ads about abortion and how he wasn't going to mess with it.
And he still got painted as an going to change abortion extremist because mainstream media allowed Bob Ferguson to say that and didn't challenge it.
Jodi, you were going to say something.
I just want to say, so at the Evans School, we have people who come to do their master's in public policy literally from all over the world. And this year at orientation, we put up clips of the two gubernatorial candidates from the debates. And we shared written statements about and neither of these candidates actually had coherent policy positions. They hadn't thought it through. And Ferguson put tons and tons and tons of information on the website. Now, these are policy wonks. It was too much for them to consume. So it was almost performative. There was so much on the website. And then, right, Kurt, it was almost impossible to get this stuff. And so it was just in a situation where you want people to build muscle and actually being able to dig into the issues, that to me has to become a standard that we bring back. Because part of why it gets so fragmented is that people don't know where to look for good information.
Right. The counterexample to this is Marie Glusenkamp-Perez. She's won twice now in the Republican district. I worked on her first race. I did comms on her first race. And I remember meeting with her the first time back in the spring of 2022. And I asked her, why shouldn't I just think you're just another standard issue progressive Democrat who's just going to get slaughtered in Southwest Washington, which is a Republican blue collar area? And she said, I ran for Skamania County Commissioner, right? Skamania County is a county of 12,000 people, totally rural, very, very Trumpian red. She's like, I knocked on doors and I met all my neighbors in Skamania County. She lost that race. It was in 2016, but she ran way ahead of Hillary Clinton on the ballot. And she said, you know what? I learned so much about why my neighbors are so unhappy. Right, and I think I know how to talk to them about their concerns and their resentments against cultural elites in cities like Portland and Seattle, and I think I can win. And I thought that was a really, really smart, interesting answer, and it turned out she was right. Like there are ways that politicians can build that bridge to the other side. Marie's a Democrat, but she knows how to talk to voters in her district. I think it's a combination of kind of lunch pail populism and a kind of, intense anti-partisanship. Like, she's not about party.
But because it's not just she knows how to talk.
Yeah.
She actually also knows how to
act. And she backs it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, she votes for her district, right? Like, so.
I want to make sure we have time for other questions. I do just want to say, my answer to your question would be, those nonpartisan Supreme Court justices, it's money. It's all money. The Democrats buried Reichert and all the initiatives in giant mountains of cash. Those nonpartisan races, the spending is, especially the outside spending, it's not so intense. So I think when the money's not involved and people are actually deciding based on what's on the voter pamphlet, it's a little bit different. Chris.
Hi. So I've been listening to this wonderful conversation. You all are really smart, and there's great perspectives happening. But the title of this presentation was Bridging the Gap. And I haven't heard anything from any of you about how to do that. I would really like to bridge the gap. I mean, Donald Trump somehow won the popular vote. Boggles my mind. I need help understanding that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I need help talking to people who actually voted for him. I think it was a horrible choice. But I want to understand why you made that choice, and I want to be able to do that within my family, within community, and I want to be able to respect the people I'm talking to. And I think that is probably one of the problems that we have in our society. We don't respect the other points of view. So are you going to have that conversation?
I think we've talked a little bit about that, right? About trying to not give so much credence to the fringes and try to. Let me give you an example. And first of all, I'm ecstatic I voted for Donald Trump. I don't regret it at all. I'm happy with what he's done so far. I have concerns about some of his tendencies, and I'm watching those closely. And I'm perfectly prepared to be disappointed, as I would be with any politician. And I'm also open to the possibility that he could do a fantastic job and take care of the issues I voted for him to take care of. So I'm really happy with it. Don't regret it for a second. Won't apologize to anyone for it. Ask me again in 6 months. Ask me again in a week, that's fine. So a little context here. When I was at Fox 13 in 2016, during the 2016 election, so 2015, I was incredibly disappointed with the direction of political discourse. I went to my boss and I said, hey, I want to start a segment called Bridging the Divide, where we bring in someone on this side and this side, and we do a segment on the news with them talking about the issues. Eventually that became a Sunday show where we kind of tried to do the same thing. I'll tell you, it was soul-sucking. I tried to do that for 5 years. And very rarely, when we brought people from opposing sides of an issue together, even with all the intention in the world to get them to find something to agree on, It was incredibly difficult. And what I had to realize, and I think it's important if we want to move forward, is I always say this on my show, we cannot have common ground without common sense. I refuse any longer to try to reason with people who aren't operating in a realm of reality. I think that's a fool's errand. So I think the task is, there's reasonable people across the political spectrum. I have mostly Democratic friends. I don't think they're evil. I don't think they're bad because they voted for Kamala Harris or acted like Joe Biden wasn't in a state of mental decline. You know, we can talk about it and we can have conversations about it. I think you try to understand like what the issues are that drove them there. For me, mine are very clear, and I articulated them at the beginning. It's the fact that we've had Democratic rule for 40 years. We've had complete Democratic control in Olympia for much of the last 15 years. We have a worse homeless crisis. We have a worse substance abuse crisis. We have a worse affordability crisis. We have a worse mental health crisis than we've ever had before. We have the lowest number of police officers per capita of any state in the nation. My husband's a law enforcement officer. He has less support than he's ever had in his job in 20 years. And for me, all of those things trump, for lack of a better phrase, this wild concern that our abortion rights, which have been codified since 1972, are going to be taken away from us. I'm pro-choice. And so that, to me, and I think that's what I try to get people to understand, is like, I'm not operating from some place of like, yay, Trump, like come in and destroy DEI and whatever it is. Like, I like some of the things he's doing. I think that the ICE immigration raids are necessary for the national security of our country. But I'm focused on the common sense issues that used to not unite us. Public safety used to unite us. Yet we had half the state pushing police defunding with nary a peep about how bad that was. So those issues to me in my life are the things that drove me into the arms of Donald Trump. And until I see some sort of semblance of, hey, we've really dropped the ball here, our policies are literally killing people. So Donald Trump might anger you and you might think he's annoying or whatever and has these tendencies, but in our state, Donald Trump is meaningless to us. What's hurting us the most here are progressive policies that are quite literally today outside these doors killing people. And so I think having those conversations and understanding where people are coming from is the only way to do that, but you have to ignore the people who have no intention of having a reasonable conversation with you, because that's where you just spin your wheels. So let's focus on the people who are here to have a dialogue.
Oh.
So I guess we're talking, what we were wondering about, how can I go talk to my dad? How can I go talk to my grandpa? Like,
Yeah.
people like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can listen, I'm happy to listen to your podcast. I'm
Right.
not interested in just consuming all the, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I'm sorry. We had our little group, and so we talked about it. So the question is, how can we, in our own circle of friends and family and all of that, how can we talk to people? Everybody's super emotional about this. I don't know if you've noticed. People get really, they get very head up about it and they close you down and everything. So I'm just kind of wondering, maybe this is, you guys are political experts or whatever. You're not psychiatrists or sociologists or whatever. So maybe this is not the right question for you. But what do you guys, I mean,
Yeah, Jodi, I want to hear what Jodi was.
So I'm not a political person. I have to say it is very simple, I think. We each just have to have courage to have those conversations that are so hard. Because Brandi has just given you her opinion. I fundamentally disagree that Donald Trump is not relevant to the state of Washington. I fundamentally believe that our country is going to be dramatically different in 4 years. But I think she's smart. And even if she wasn't smart, I need to be able to have the courage to say, I don't agree with you. And then maybe she will look at me as a human and we'll have a conversation. And it is so hard. And we not only have to be courageous ourselves, we really have to show the young people in our life that we as grown-ups know how to do this. Because the grown-up, they're looking to us, we were talking about that, they're looking to us to be grown-ups in being able to disagree better. we've not been disagreeing very well because we're so scared. Get over it. Let's disagree. Let's talk about what we are worrying about, because right now we've lost that ability, and that's where we have a crisis.
So, I mean, people have strong feelings about politics, right? I have strong feelings about, I have strong political views. Whether I'm in alignment with my party or not on them, I have spent a lot of time thinking about politics. At the same time, I think it's really important. So how do you have the conversation? First of all, you have the conversation by demoralize your own politics, right? Like, accept that you are a flawed human being and that you do not have a monopoly on the truth. And when you start from a place like that, you can still have strong views and be open to the conversation about hearing somebody contradict you about it, right? And so I really feel strongly, like, Brandi sometimes invites me on her show, and if she does, and if I can make it, I will come on and have the conversation with her, like, and which is, I'm not shy about acknowledging where I totally disagree, right? Or my criticisms of her, funders or her audience or what, at the same time, like, I think that dialogue is really important. I can detach myself enough from the conversation that I'm not going to freak out if Brandi tells me, like, that I'm full of crap, right? That's fine. Let's then, like, kind of work through the dialogue.
Kind of made a fun.
Yeah.
Like, we tease each other a lot.
If you come into it, you have to come into the right headspace. Now, maybe sometimes the people, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go on every, person on the other side's show, or some people are not in that headspace, right? And so you've got to, like, kind of find the moments when there are people willing to kind of engage in the same way. But if you come at it from a willingness to not judge, right? Like I don't know, I'm sounding very Christian here or something, like the example of Jesus. I'm not Christian, I'm not even religious, but there's something to that, right? I think we have moralized our politics to the point that it's become very, very detrimental to our ability to actually use our politics to deliver results.
And can I just say from a personal, so I think we didn't even have the conversation, we just joke with each other. So I saw him today, I was like, there's my best friend. Yeah. But we just agree, and we just have fun, so I think we're both in that headspace. But it does have to be a two-way conversation, and taking my political commentator hat off, can I tell you what I did with my mother? So there's 4 of us kids, and my mom found out that my sister, who was the last holdout, voted for Donald Trump as well. And so that was 4 of us, all 4 voted for Donald Trump. And my mom sent us a really long group text, and it was really hurtful and mean. I mean, she knows her kids, she raised us, we're smart, we're independent thinkers. I mean, she brought up my dead father, he was very abusive towards her, and like, it got really personal, like maybe if I hadn't to let your dad treat me that way, you wouldn't vote for a man who treats women that way. I mean, it was really hurtful. And so what I did is I called her. And I gave her an ultimatum, basically. I said, either I don't want any more messages about Donald Trump, or I want to talk right now about this issue so we can be more respectful. Because I said, honestly, Mom, that hurts my feelings, and it offends me because my husband also voted for Donald Trump. And so her text, I said, don't you love my husband? And she adores him. Of course I do. My husband's the sweetest person on the planet. And he treats me great. I'm like, do you think he treats me well? She's like, of course. And I said, well, he voted for Donald Trump. So when you say stuff like that, it's offensive to me, it's offensive to my husband. And then she comes back to reality. So it's not about Donald Trump anymore. It's about her kids. It's about her son-in-law, and understanding that, like, I've known that, because we all have those stories about people who have alienated friendships over this, alienated family members. And when you think about that, that's profoundly sad. And so I think it's both people have to be willing to engage, for sure, but trying to bring it back to a personal point, like, this is me. This is me. This is your daughter. You've known me for 35 years, So that worked for me with my mom, and she has not, ever since then, it has only been pleasant when we talk about Donald Trump. And we just avoid it if it's not going to be pleasant, so.
Yeah, we got another question back in the corner.
Okay, this might be poorly timed, but I guess I want to challenge the underlying assumption with this event was called Bridging the Gap, and I want to challenge the assumption of whether or not building consensus is actually the appropriate move for this moment in time, because as you guys have mentioned, there's crisis in multiple fronts, both in our institutions. With the heroin crisis, that's a symptom of greater despair. I'm a millennial. Nearly every woman I know is afraid that she's not able to afford having a family or owning a house. And so my theory on why Donald Trump won is that he always brands himself as a fighter because he creates, and it's a nasty one, but he creates a really competitive marketplace of ideas. So I guess my question is, should we be actually searching for consensus or searching for solutions?
I want to be clear. I don't think we've said anything about searching for consensus, and I don't want you to misread what I said. I think we need to listen courageously to each other. I also will push back. I don't think Donald Trump is somebody who brings a lot of ideas. I think he brings a lot of misinformation, things that are factually not true. There is no evidence for them. But that disconnect between an empirical base, again, I'm the researcher, is pretty significant. And so for me, I want debate. I want actual debate about really what do we know about the issues and the solutions, because they're trade-offs. In any democracy, there's a trade-off. But we're so far from anything based on fact that to me is what we have to hold each other accountable for. Everybody has the right to have an opinion, but there is a difference between an opinion and facts.
Yeah, I don't think you have to let people. My opinion on that's going to be twofold. I don't think that Donald Trump has a monopoly on political lies. I've been covering politics for 15 years. Politicians are very good at it. They like to spin a tale. But I don't think that consensus or trying to find solutions means you have to abandon your deeply held principles, you have to throw them to the wind, or that you have to accept things that you don't believe are true. The thing about consensus is just a little different. I think the problem in our state, to bring it local, is there's really no dissent. So when you go and you're trying to solve problems, you have Democrats in Olympia who have the monopoly on power. They don't need a single Republican vote. And so it's the equivalent of grading your own test. So they're like A+, A++++, and there's no demand to be introspective. There's no electoral consequences for them. And so they actually don't have to worry about building consensus because they can just go with whatever their party and their caucus want to go with. And that actually, to me, having divided government, it's one of the things that why I supported so many Republican candidates is I just want divided government. Because I'd rather our government be stalled out than these situations continue to get worse. So I don't know that I need consensus, but I do need dissent. And healthy dissent is just getting out of an echo chamber and like, hey, I'm forced to listen to a different idea because without a few of those people on that side, I can't push my policy through. And I think that's what's missing from our state's political dialogue.
I just want to reinforce that because I actually think it's connected to your point about solution seeking. I think that because there is not much dissent here, it goes to my earlier point about implementation. There are things that happen in good political debates where you're discussing something that you care about and you realize something in that conversation that there's a truth of like, oh, we need to talk to this group of people to figure out how to actually get something done. That's what Marie does well. Yeah. And because we don't do that as much in this state, I would argue, it's why we have a gap between the idea of the policy and what is on the ground. And so I think to find solutions, we must have dissent. We must. 'Cause nobody's that smart.
Oh, sorry. I don't want to. We're coming up towards time. I want to maybe have time for one more question, unless Sandeep.
No, I don't have any.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to jump in. Julie, we got one more.
Come
Any
on,
others?
make it a good one.
Oh man. Oh. Wow. Well, could
All
we
right.
potentially end on time? No.
No.
No. Come on.
So,
Why would we do that?
I think underlying perhaps the question before was the idea that, when we signed up for this session, it was like a month ago. Mm-hmm. A lot's happened in a month. There's a new president who's actively dismantling the government. So the idea of bridging the gap is a different question now than it was when I signed up for this. And to kind of get at the point of, you know, should we be bridging a gap? I'm kind of wondering.
I'd like to bridge the gap with you.
Sandeep,
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about what gap maybe you need to be bridging. And your gap may not be the gap between you and Donald Trump that you need to bridge, but maybe you need to bridge the gap between the non-college educated black woman who's a grocery store checker in Greenville, South Carolina, who voted for Barack Obama and is now voting for Donald Trump. Maybe everybody in this room that's kind of a privileged, educated, Seattle affluent resident, like, needs to think about why we just lost this election and how do we bridge the gap with the people we lost, right? Right? And so that, and it doesn't mean agreeing with stuff you disagree with. There are things I profoundly disagree with about MAGA and the Republican Party, and I'm not in the mood to, elide that, right, or to hide that. At the same time, I see a problem on my side that we're losing people that I think we should be getting, and that I think we should be speaking with and speaking for, right? And so there's always the gaps are multiple and profound, right? And the gaps are gaps not just of ideology, but of class and of culture and of and of party and all this other stuff, right? So anyway,
I also felt like the premise when we said yes is changed. And I do believe that the bridge to the gap thing is to learn more from different points of view, because I really do believe that what is happening now as the government is being dismantled will horrify some people. Now, there's a lot of improvement that needed to happen in government, so let's bridge the gap and make that happen. Let's actually make the civil service robust. Let's actually create an HR system where we're bringing in the best talent to work in the public sector. There's a whole long laundry list of improvements to public service provision that we've needed to get done. Let's do that.
I actually think that, Sandeep, that was a good note to sort of end the conversation on, which is it doesn't have to be as daunting as I got to bridge the gap with Donald Trump supporters. If that really is like such a tall task, you can bridge the gap with people in your inner circle who might be engaged in behavior that is alienating people who've gone to Donald Trump, who might be pushing extreme policies like police defunding or rent control or whatever it is, and try to understand why they're doing that and see if you can kind of build a better sort of consensus amongst your group and then see what comes from there. But I'll tell you this, just because a lot of, I get where you're coming from. I used to be total anti-Donald Trump, so I understand I've been there. I usually say no to things like this, because whenever I do things like this with like kind of mainstream Seattle entities, I'm always the conservative foil. And I feel like conservatives are treated really unfairly. But more and more, I want to come to these places and show people, like, hey, I voted for Donald Trump. Here's why. Like, I'm not an evil person. I have my reasons, and I'm not a boogeyman. And so I hope that you leave open the possibility. The answer can't be writing off 77 million Americans. It can't be. And if that's what people want to do because they don't like Donald Trump, then this isn't the panel. This isn't the room for you. This isn't the place for you. But since you're here, that tells me that's not what you want to do. It's about trying to understand where they're coming from, their experiences, and moving forward from there. And don't even think about Donald Trump. Think about those voters, what's going on with their lives, and move forward with that, the ones who are willing to move forward with you.
And in that spirit, pay attention to local news, because it's still happening. It's still happening. I think we're at time, and I think that was a great note to end on. I keep thinking about this question we had back in the corner about the building consensus and is it important anymore. I think for a long time our democracy has, or whatever we call it, constitutional republic, has been based around consensus. The idea that you need Congress to, approve your cabinet and things like that. Consensus is going out of style, and I think about it a lot, with Donald Trump because of I think populism, and I do as a journalist, just thinking about why the importance of consensus, or just the importance of understanding like a change, a really massive change in our civic life, is just kind of understanding why we got here. Apparently that focus on consensus has failed us in some way, and so I appreciate like every question that has poked holes in the premise of this event, and I really appreciate you all coming out. I don't want to say something as sappy as, you're helping to fix the problem, but I definitely, I don't think it got worse tonight. So thank you all for coming. Give a big round of applause for our people, and yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Scott, and our speakers. A big thank you to our legislative preview sponsors, Puget Sound Energy and Comcast. And there will be an evaluation that you'll receive, so please complete it for us. And join us next month on March 5th for our second Civic Cocktail, Seattle Safety Check, Leaders Weigh In on Crime, Policy, and Solutions. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.